Test 1 2, test 1 2.
Thank you, sir.
What else do we need?
Well, apparently this works correctly now, so I don't think we need anything else.
We're good.
We're good.
Are you sure? Do you want me to lead it?
So far, we're okay. I'll let you know if anything else happens.
Kind of looks like Leonardo DiCaprio, huh?
No. Leonardo DiCaprio looks like him. Let's get our priorities straight here. This is the czar of all the Russias, not some entertainer. The dignity of history. Well, okay. I think now we're set. Can everyone hear me now? If you can't, then move closer because this is the best we can do. As I said, the three royal families disappeared very, very quickly within a year of each other. On March the 15th, 1917, the Tsar of all the Russias, Nicholas II, abdicated for himself and his hemophiliac son, which brought to an end the 304-year rule of the Romanovs after his brother refused the crown. He wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. On November 26, 1918, William II, Emperor of Germany and King of Prussia, abdicated, having previously fled to Holland at the end of World War I after his military advisors told him that the oath of loyalty they had all taken to him and to his family was now really just a fiction. Die Gefangene ist nur eine Idee. He took a short trip from Spa, Belgium to Holland and remained in exile for the rest of his life, bringing to an end the 217-year rule of the Hohenzollerns. On November 11th, 1918, Charles I, the Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, absolved his subjects from their loyalty oath and subsequently left for Switzerland. He never formally abdicated because he kept hoping that the Hungarians at least would restore him, and he made 2 trips back to Hungary to try to bring this about, and they failed, and he went back to Switzerland and passed away shortly after that, which ended the 466-year rule of the Habsburgs. The collapse of 3 such important families and what came afterwards is surely worth examining, and so today I hope to spend a little time covering rather quickly some of the highlights, if that's the right word, some of the features of the rule of these 3 families in the 19th century and remind you of what came afterwards. Anyone here who is familiar with this material to any extent will be aware I'm leaving out a few things. Of course, historians always have to, but we have a limited amount of time here. I'm not sure I didn't bite off more than I can chew when I chose the topic, but at any rate, let us take a look at that. Russia was different from the other European countries, aside from the fact that most of it isn't in Europe, but geographically, but it was a little different in that Russia was an absolute monarchy. The idea that the people should have some say in the government to some extent had spread practically everywhere else, but not into Russia. Russia was also, at the end of the 19th century, one of only 3 civilized countries in the world that still had slavery, the other 2 being Brazil and, of course, the United States. But in Russia, this slavery, or serfdom as it was called, was a little different from most places that have had it. The slaves were not a member of some easily identifiable group. They were the bulk of the Russian people. 85% of Russians were serfs. If you were a landowner and bought a village, you owned all the people in it, as well as the buildings and the farm animals. This was a system that had to come to an end at some point and was a little problem for Russia. Russia was ruled by men with very different personalities in this period. Nicholas I, R means reigned or ruled, Tsar for 30 years, was sometimes known as the Tsar autocrat, absolute ruler. Nicholas was by no means a cruel or harsh man. He ruled as best he could, but he inherited the traditional system of ruling, and that was it. In Russia, there was no such thing as voting, parliaments, input. The Tsar and whoever he chose to advise him simply ruled the country. Nicholas presided over a rather frozen society. He himself thought that serfdom had to go, but he couldn't quite figure out a way to get rid of it without terrible economic harm. And then at the end of his reign, this Tsar, who had spent most of his time with the army, which he loved, and they had the largest army in Europe, became involved in a war when he decided to try to take advantage of what he called famously the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, by taking some of their territory in Europe. He unfortunately seemed to have forgotten that the sick man had some very healthy friends, namely France and England, with the result that he became involved in the Crimean War. The Crimea was invaded by French and British armies, which were not particularly well commanded, especially the British one, but he couldn't get rid of them. In fact, the transportation system in Russia was so bad that they had trouble getting a substantial number of troops into the Crimea and then feeding them because they hadn't built enough railroads. He died in 1855 in the midst of this war rather suddenly. Indeed, it's suggested that he sort of committed suicide. He was in the capital, St. Petersburg, which is rather chilly in the winter, and went outside to inspect some troops without an overcoat. He caught pneumonia and passed away. It is thought he died of a broken heart because of the fact that his army was doing so poorly. He was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. Alexander II was a very different man from his father. Whereas his father had been stern and good at making decisions and sticking to them, even if they were the wrong decisions, Alexander was a much more thoughtful man, a man who was more hesitant, but a man who was firmly convinced that Russia had terrible internal problems. The last thing they needed was a war, and he had to try to solve them. He ended the war as quickly as possible on somewhat unfavorable terms, but that didn't seem to matter at this point. The war at least was over, and he turned his attention to reforming Russia. Alexander II is known as the Tsar Liberator because he freed the serfs. After years and years of debate at the top of how to go about doing this, he finally lost patience and simply wrote a decree that freed the serfs. He had absolute power. The details of this we can't go into. Many of the ex-serfs were a little disappointed they didn't get more land, but they were now free before the law. It was a very good thing to do. He reformed the army. The army had not done well in the Crimea. The Russians always fight bravely, but, well, until recently, they always fight, traditionally have fought bravely, but sometimes without much skill. But the Russian army, which consisted mostly of, well, serfs, was very cruel. When someone was drafted into the army under Nicholas I, you were drafted for 25 years. That was it. Your wife, if you had one, was free to marry after 7 years because it was assumed she'd never see you again. The officers routinely kicked, beat, and struck the men, and that wasn't even considered punishment. That was how you got their attention. Alexander said this has to change. The term of enlistment was cut to 7 years. Internal conditions were improved. It was some attempt to give self-respect to the men. He reformed the courts of Russia. The courts of Russia were corrupt. Rich people always won their cases. Now, the freed serfs, who were, after all, citizens, would be equal before the law. That at least was the idea, and it had some success. Alexander, in other words, was a strikingly generous czar who really was trying to improve Russia. Many people were still discontented. Those who wanted major changes felt that there was one thing they didn't have yet, was a constitution. And Alexander was not planning on granting a constitution and a parliament. He was thinking vaguely in those terms, but that was much too far out. And so revolutionary groups of anarchists and nihilists decided that they would try to destroy the system, starting out with killing the Tsar. Also, Poles didn't like the Tsar because Poland was subject to Russia, and Russia treated Poland fairly harshly, even under Alexander II. And so Alexander II had to go through quite a bit. In 1866, a revolutionary tried to shoot him in St. Petersburg, but a man standing near this fellow noticed the pistol, hit the pistol, and the bullet missed. In 1867, he was visiting France, and while he was in the carriage with the Emperor Napoleon III, a Polish assassin approached the carriage, pulled the trigger on his pistol. The pistol exploded, wounding him, but it didn't hurt anybody else. Pistols didn't seem to do the job, so in 1879, a group called the People's Will. Whenever you run into anything in history called the People's anything, you got to be wary of it. The People's Will decided to blow up his train. The Tsar traveled in a train with other trains and on alternate routes, and they did indeed blow up a train. It was the wrong train. The Tsar was not on that one. That having failed, the next year they decided to blow up his palace. I'm not making this up, by the way. It all actually happened. They decided to place bombs in the cellar of the palace and blow up the imperial dining room. Now, you might think, you can't just carry a bomb into the imperial palace, can you? There must be a guard or two standing there. One of the revolutionaries got a job as a carpenter during some repairs, and each day he'd smuggle in a little bit of explosives until they had quite a bit of them in the cellar. And on the appointed day, the timer was set. The plan was not just to kill the Tsar, but to blow up everyone at a state dinner, the whole imperial family and all of the important and royal guests. But one of the guests was late. And as the Tsar and his entourage approached this glittering dining room in the Winter Palace, it blew up in their faces, killing and injuring over 50 soldiers who were on guard, but not harming the Tsar at all. By now, the Tsar was wondering if reforms really were a good idea. Things were not going so well. He was puzzled by this reaction on the part of some of his subjects. On one occasion, when he was told that some important person had spoken ill of him, he said, "That's very strange. I never did him a favor. Why does he hate me?" And when he was asked by someone if that's what he thought of people, he said, "Yes, I've discovered that all I have to do to make an enemy is to be nice to someone." But despite all of this, he persisted in his idea of reforms and embraced the notion of having elections. I'm not sure they had a word for that in Russian at that time, elections on a very local level among the peasantry. And this was revolutionary. He signed the decree. But a few days later, the people's will had decided to blow up the street on which he was traveling by placing bombs in the sewers. They did not do this because the head of the people's will, Zhelyabov, was captured by the secret police, and the secret police have ways of making you talk. So Zhelyabov's wife, who was also a revolutionary, dispatched assassins to throw hand grenades at the Tsar. And as the Tsar was returning from a sojourn in the city, with an escort, of course, one of these assassins threw a bomb, which exploded and missed the Tsar. It wounded a couple of soldiers and a carriage. And the Tsar, rather than driving off immediately, got out of the carriage and went to see the injured men. And when a policeman came up and said, "Sir, are you all right?" he said, "Yes, I am all right, thank God." And another voice came out of the crowd, "It's too early to thank God." And another assassin threw another bomb, which mortally wounded the Tsar. They say there is a third assassin in the crowd with a bomb in a briefcase too, but he didn't have to use it. The dying Tsar was carried to the palace and expired there. He got the reward, I guess, that you get for freeing slaves, the same that Abraham Lincoln got. He was succeeded by his son, Alexander III. Alexander III had disagreed with many of his father's reforms because he was much more conservative, but he also was horrified by what had happened and concluded that reforms were not the way to go. As you can probably see from this portrait, he was a man of stern resolve. Not someone you argued with. He was a huge man. He could bend horseshoes with his bare hands. He had a very clear idea of how to govern Russia, which is to go back to the way of Nicholas I. He was like his grandfather, rule and change nothing. And he did that for 13 years. He, again, was not cruel or deliberately harsh, but he was stern. And Russia was not going to have any more big changes. When you have big changes, look what happens. And so the secret police were active in suppressing revolutionary movements. Alexander ruled without changing anything. In foreign policy, he made a very important alliance with France, but that's outside of our topic today. Alexander III kept things as they were, but pressure was building up underneath. Russia was becoming industrialized. Industrial workers had no rights. There were no unions or anything like that, of course. And as a result, pressure was building, and the Tsar was unaware of it. He never left whatever palace he was staying at. He had no contact with the people of Russia. He didn't think he needed any, and his security advisors, of course, said, "Please don't go outside. It's people out there with bombs." So he lived a very restricted life. It was assumed that such a man would probably rule. He spent his summers, by the way, in Denmark with his in-laws because his wife was a Danish princess. It was assumed that such a man would rule for a long time. He looked like he lived to be 90. In 1894, he developed a very serious kidney disease and was dead in 2 months at the age of 49. That was the end of Alexander III. And he was succeeded by the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Nicholas II was like his grandfather, Alexander II, a kind man, a nice man. I don't think anyone who met him ever could have disliked him. And he is a perfect example of how it is possible to be a very good man and a very bad ruler. Nicholas II was weak-willed. He wanted to do the right thing, but he could never decide what it was. He would change his mind very often. He was rather like someone, and this was a term used to describe another person in history, but Nicholas, I think it applies too. He was like sort of like a cushion who bore the imprint of the last person who sat on him. He took much too much advice, but the person who most influenced him was dead, was his father. Alexander III's tremendous personality had made a great impression on his kindly son, and the idea that his father might have been wrong about anything did not enter his head. This man truly believed in divine right monarchy. Power comes from God. The Romanov family's power was given by God. That has a lot of responsibility, do a good job, but no one can question it. He was also aided in this belief by his wife, who was not Russian. She was German, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, but she was German origin. The Empress had no understanding of Russian politics, indeed learned Russian as I think a third language, and constantly advised her husband rather badly. As late as 1916, when everything was just about to collapse, in one of her many letters to her husband, who was commanding the army at the front. He was 400 miles behind the front, but he was not in St. Petersburg. She says to him, "Remember, Nicky, Russia loves to feel the whip." Unfortunately, the Russians were getting a little tired of the whip by this time. And of course, they had no idea of the whips to come. But at any rate, she did not assist in things. Nicholas could not rule effectively. The result was that Russia bobbled along with more and more revolutionary movements, every once in a while outbreak of rebellion. And then in 1904, 1905, he got a wake-up call when he went to war with Japan. Russia's encroachments in the Far East had disturbed the Japanese, who had taken over Korea, and the Japanese decided to go to war with Russia. They did this by launching a surprise attack, a naval attack that sank the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, something that maybe the United States should have studied a little more carefully about how Japan starts wars. At any rate, they started the war with a naval victory, landed troops in Manchuria. On paper, Japan was a new power. They had a new navy built by them for the English. I mean, they paid for it, but they had no shipyards in Japan. They had an army that was trained along the French and German models, but had never really fought in a major war. Russia was one of the greatest powers in the world, but to fight a war against Japan at the end of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was very, very difficult. And the Russian army was not very well commanded. They lost all of the land battles. They sent their Baltic fleet all the way around the world. It wouldn't fit through the Suez Canal, all the way around Africa to try to redress the situation. And the whole Russian fleet was sunk in one day at the Battle of Tsushima by Admiral Togo. And then a revolution broke out in Russia, an uprising by peasants and people in the cities. And it looked as though the regime was coming to an end. Well, it didn't come to an end. Nicholas ended the war as quickly as he could. The treaty, by the way, does anyone know where the treaty that ended the war, Russo-Japanese War, was signed? Well, it starts with a P. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Treaty of Portsmouth. And the reason it was signed there was because of the intervention of the United States in what is called diplomatic good offices to bring the two sides together. And as a result of that, the Nobel Peace Prize for 1905 was given to Teddy Roosevelt, of all people, perhaps the most bellicose American president, but he got the prize. The revolution was put down by force. The army stayed loyal, but the Tsar was persuaded, much against his will, to give a constitution to Russia. He granted a Duma, a parliament, voting political parties. On paper, Russia had become a constitutional monarchy. It was the smartest thing he ever did. He hated himself for it. He had given up power that was given him by God. You can't do that. And so he did his best to ignore the Duma over the next 10 years and successfully did so. In fact, when the Duma seemed to him a little too radical, he just changed the election law so that the rich had most of the votes. And although he still didn't like the Duma, it didn't give him a whole lot of trouble until he got Russia into World War I. Now, the origins of World War I are a completely separate topic that we cannot go into here. Russia played a role in getting that war started. But the main thing for our purposes is that Russia did not do well. The army was beaten repeatedly, and even when they occasionally won, their casualties were astronomical, which is not unusual in World War I, of course. Famine began to spread. The Tsar himself had very little power, really. He didn't know what to do, and the military men tried to do their best. It didn't really work. The whole thing was just not working very well. And finally, in 1917, a revolution broke out in what was then called Petrograd. St. Petersburg was a much too Germanic name, so they called it Petrograd. Then it became Leningrad. Then it became St. Petersburg again. But anyway, a revolution broke out, and in 3 days, no more Romanovs. The Tsar had no support left. Nobody supported him at all. The Tsar, trying to return to the capital, wound up off on a railway siding because the little railway workers just changed the switches, and that was the Tsar couldn't get to where he wanted to go. He was persuaded to abdicate, and he and his family were taken into protective custody, house arrest, by the provisional government, which had no intention of harming him. However, the provisional government didn't last long. We'll get to that a little bit later. And so the Romanovs came to an end. Russia had to have some changes. And it is a great pity that Alexander III and Nicholas II could not see the way history was moving, but that was the end of the Romanov dynasty. And at the time it fell, nobody really felt very sorry for it. That perhaps would come later. That's the man who ultimately won in what Russia was going to have. Russia now had, as a result of overthrowing the Tsar, first, they stayed in the war. The provisional government was overthrown in the October Revolution, which was really the October coup. The Bolshevik party very skillfully seized power. Many people didn't like this, so then Russia had a civil war for 2 years with all the horrors that a civil war brings. Then after that, they had a war with Poland when Poland invaded Russia, trying to get back territory they had had in the 18th century. The Russians succeeded in driving the Poles out and then were defeated at the Battle of Warsaw and signed a peace treaty which left the Ukraine partly in Poland and partly in Russia. Then after that, Lenin died shortly thereafter, and then we get Stalin. I don't have a slide of Stalin. I don't like to look at him. As a result of that, we can say, I think, that if you were given a choice, would you rather be ruled by Lenin and Stalin or by Nicholas II with all his faults? I think the choice is pretty easy. The fall of the Tsar did not necessarily bring great happiness to Russia. Let us turn now to Germany. Germany did not exist as a country until 1871. The Germanic people were there and German states were there, in fact, over 300 of them in the Holy Roman Empire. Austria, which was partly German, dominated the German states, and Prussia was by far the largest of the states actually inside of Germany. But it wasn't until 1871 that Germany unified as a country under the first Kaiser, William I, King of Prussia. The reason they were able to do this was because William I chose an exceptionally good prime minister, Otto von Bismarck, perhaps the greatest diplomat who ever lived. Bismarck had the goal of unifying the German states, of which by now there were about 19, under Prussian leadership and excluding the Austrian Germans. He did this by winning 3 wars. First, a war with Denmark over the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein, in which he allied with Austria. Austria and Prussia against Denmark is a bit one-sided, and the Danes gave up those 2 provinces. Then, having lulled the Austrians to a sense of security, he provoked a war with Austria. And in what is used to be called, anyway, the 7 Weeks' War, the Prussian army defeated the Austrians entirely, and they signed a peace treaty. Bismarck had nothing to do with the directing of military operations. He was a civilian, which is why I chose a rather rare picture of him in civilian garb. You often see him dressed as a soldier, which is an honorary appointment, with sort of protective coloration among all the other soldiers in the king's entourage, but he firmly believed in civilian control of the military. Bismarck, having won this war, then signed a peace treaty in such a way that Austria became his ally 3 years later. There was no lasting resentment. That's quite a trick. Then, having unified the North German states under Prussian leadership, but not the South German states, because if he took them all at once, he'd provoke France. Now he was ready to provoke France. And having provoked the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussian army annihilated the French in a series of victories, captured Napoleon III, who was then overthrown in a revolution, won the war, and when Paris was surrounded and the people had been reduced to eating the animals in the zoo, France surrendered. The German Empire was proclaimed under Kaiser William I. Germany had a large population of industrious and ingenious people, and in the next few years, they became certainly a great power. Their industrial production shot skyward. Now, Germany, Prussia had had a constitution since 1848. There was a Reichstag, a parliament, certainly, and it had some power. But no party ever had a majority in the Reichstag, and the king appointed the chancellor, regardless of how much support he had. But Bismarck had a lot of support. He was regarded by now as a genius, which he was. And as a result, he had little trouble in governing Germany in the period after the Franco-Prussian War. He also became a man of peace. Bismarck was not a warmonger in the slightest degree. I like to say to my students that he used war as a surgeon uses a scalpel. You have a very specific goal, you accomplish it, and you stop. And that's how he did that. After 1871, Germany had everything he wanted. There was nothing else that could help Germany by gaining any territory, and therefore preserving the peace of Europe became his main criterion. He had alliances with Russia and with Austria and with Italy, and was on extremely friendly terms with Britain, which was a traditional ally since the Prussian and British armies had done well at the Battle of Waterloo sometime before against the French. France was resentful because they had lost the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, but France by itself could not do anything against Germany with the support of Russia and Austria and Italy and the friendship of Britain. So that solved his foreign policy problems. He ruled successfully. William I's chief contribution to all of this was recognizing that in Bismarck he had a genius and backing Bismarck up in all cases, because of course William was the boss and appointed the chancellor. William passed away in 1888. William was 62 years old when he became emperor, and probably assumed, or rather became king of Prussia, and probably assumed he wouldn't be there for all that long. He didn't know he was going to live to be 91. But he died in 1888 of natural causes, leaving the throne to his eldest son, Frederick III. You may never have heard of Frederick III. Frederick III was a successful soldier, greatly respected, married to Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, a liberal, it was thought, who would make Germany more liberal. And when he came to the throne, he soon discovered he had incurable throat cancer and died 3 months later. Frederick III is one of those unfortunate footnotes in history, leaving his crown to William II. Kaiser William II, Kaiser Bill to Americans in World War I, a man who was greatly misunderstood. Indeed, this picture sort of shows why he could be easily misunderstood, doesn't it? And if you go along with this picture back here, when the French ambassador saw this portrait, he said, "That's not a picture, it's a declaration of war." William II is, however, somewhat misunderstood because he was not a lunatic warmonger. He was not a bad man. He was a man who, as Churchill once said, wanted all of Napoleon's prestige without fighting any of Napoleon's battles. He was a brash man. He would say things that sounded very bad when they were put into the newspapers. He would shoot off his mouth. He would make outrageous statements. He would tell recruits in the army, because he was always worried there was going to be a socialist revolution in Germany, of which there was no chance at all. But he was afraid of the socialists, who had a fairly large political party. He told the recruits, if there are social unrest in Germany, if there is an uprising, you may have to shoot your parents and relatives if I order it. He didn't mean that. But how does that look in the newspapers? When troops were going off to fight the Boxer Rebellion in China, he said, remember, you are descended from the Huns, which is not true. And you must make it so no Chinese will dare to look you in the face. He once said, I have never read the Constitution, and I pay no attention to it. That wasn't true either. It's really good that he didn't have a Twitter account. It would have been much worse. As things were, he was a very bad PR man for Germany. He loved uniforms, inspections, parades. He would change his uniform 2 or 3 times a day. Once on attending a performance of the opera The Flying Dutchman, which of course is set at sea, he insisted on wearing an admiral's uniform. The man was flamboyant, but he didn't rule Germany. There was a chancellor whom he appointed, of course, but the chancellors he appointed were all, I'm not going to go through them, there were 4 of them, but they were all responsible and decent men. The Reichstag had to approve all the budgetary expenditures. And William certainly did not sit there ruling the country. He was sort of the public representative of the country, and it must be said, he could have done a better job. The first thing that happened is that he quarreled with Bismarck. This is not surprising. Bismarck was now in his 70s, and William, when he took the throne, was 29. There was bound to be some little conflict there. Bismarck was used to telling the emperor what to do, politely, and William was not going to be treated like that. William shot his mouth off, and Bismarck, the great diplomat, would not sneeze without first considering the diplomatic implications that such an act might cause. And the result was, within 2 years of William coming to power, Bismarck was forced to resign. We have the most famous cartoon that was ever drawn by an Englishman, John Tenniel, dropping the pilot who has guided the ship through the reefs and waters, gets into his dinghy to row ashore, and the new captain watches indifferently from above. This was a great loss, although Bismarck was approaching the end of his career in any event. William II then presided over Germany. Again, I have to omit a lot of years here. When World War I came, in the origins of which Germany played a major role, to be sure, the Kaiser was reduced to a figurehead. He was not a military man, despite the fact of he liked the uniforms and he liked to be called the all-highest warlord and other wonderful titles. He was not going to be directing the army. The army ran things, and when Hindenburg and Ludendorff came in 1916, the Kaiser was reduced to handing out medals, making speeches, and presiding over the defeat of Germany in World War I. In 1918, as I said at the start, it was made clear to him he had to go, and he went. He went to Holland, which was a very short trip. Here he is shown with his second wife, his first wife having died. He married another lady. He's shown with the second wife and his youngest stepchild. That was in 1918. He lived until 1940 in exile in Holland. In 1940, when he died, Holland was under German occupation, but that was another war. And that was the end of the Hohenzollerns. Well, what happened in Germany after the Hohenzollerns left? The new government had some troubles. First, they had to sign a treaty. Again, we can't go into the Treaty of Versailles here, which was considered very unfavorable by most Germans, and they blamed it on the government, although the government had little choice. Then the government of what was called the Weimar Republic, W-E-I-M-A-R, named after the city where the Constitution was written. It was a very nice Constitution, by the way, it just didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Then had a socialist uprising, the Spartacist uprising, which had to be put down with force. And then they had the period of inflation where the money became completely worthless and the savings of the middle class were completely wiped out. Then they had 4 good years, 25 to 29. Things appeared to be more stable. Hindenburg was president, a popular figure at home and abroad, and then came the Depression. Then came the Depression and the fact that there was no majority in the Reichstag and nobody knew what to do, and you couldn't elect a group of people who would run things. This is a ballot during the Weimar Republic. Each one of those is a separate political party. And the way the system worked, it wasn't like, I mean, when we go to vote next week, you'll find at the bottom, I hope I don't offend any minority party supporters here, but you will find parties you've never heard of before, the legalized marijuana party or something like that, which you could vote for, but you're never going to hear from them again. The way the Reichstag was set up, if you got 1% of the vote, you got 1% of the seats. So there were a lot of parties that wound up in the Reichstag. This is probably not a good thing. Germany needed a charismatic figure who could unify it, someone who said he could solve the problems of the Depression. And they got one. They got one all right when on January 30th, 1933, President von Hindenburg, against his better judgment and somewhat against his will, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of the Reich, the fourth Chancellor in 6 months, the man who had the largest political party, although not quite a majority. It was thought that he would bring stability. Well, he did solve the problem of too many political parties because a year later there was only one. But we can say safely that the cure was worse than the disease. And again, would you rather be ruled by Adolf Hitler or by William II? I don't think we have to take a vote to decide the answer to that one. So perhaps the abolition of the German monarchy did not work out all that well. Now, when we turn our attention to Austria, we realize that Austria is somewhat different from most of the countries of Europe. We think of a country as being primarily an ethnic group that has the same language and a common culture. That's what a country is. But this country didn't. This was the Habsburg family ranch. They had accumulated a lot of acreage over the centuries. By marriage, primarily. There was a saying even in the Middle Ages, let others fight wars, you, happy Austria, marry. And there was also a saying that Austria should eventually rule the whole world, not so much by force, but by incorporating all these groups one way or another. As you can see here, we have Germans, who are about 1/3 of the population, and the royal family, and Hungarians or Magyars, who are about 1/3 of the population. And then here, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians. And it's a mistake to put Croats and Serbs together because they hated each other. However, they were so mixed together that you can't really separate them even on a map this size. How could anyone rule a country like this? It was probably doomed. Nationalism, the idea that you should have your own country if you're a separate group, is very strong in the modern world. It still is. And yet the Habsburg family was ruling over a country with many different religions, innumerable different languages, many of whom wished to be independent. And yet somehow they held it together until World War I forced it apart. Francis Joseph I became Emperor of Austria in 1849 at the age of 19 and ruled until he was 86 years old. Francis Joseph I was a good man who tried his best, but somehow things didn't always work out. Austria lost most of its wars, wars to Italy, where they had to give up territory there in northern Italy, 1866, the war to Bismarck, where they lost their influence in Germany. But nonetheless, he carried on somehow. Francis Joseph I split the country in two in 1867 by the Compromise of 1867. In order to prevent the country falling apart, it was decided to give independence, internal independence, to the Hungarians, the Magyars, the second largest ethnic group. As a result, the country became known as the dual monarchy, as D-U-A-L, not D-U-E-L, the dual monarchy, and he took two titles, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary. After that, in Austria, as I will continue to call it, they had two of everything, or most things, two prime ministers, two systems of education, two departments of the interior, two everything except one emperor with two titles, one army in which the language of command was German, and although the units were all ethnically set up, and one foreign ministry. There was one foreign policy for Austria. When one looks at this part of the world today, it is a miracle that any country could hold it together, but somehow they did. Somehow, during the period of Austrian rule, there were no massacres or ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. There were no disasters or catastrophes. Things bobbled along, maybe not brilliantly, but they went along. And indeed, the Austrian attitude, at least the German-Austrian attitude, was somewhat more laid back than in the country to the north. They even had a saying in Vienna, the capital of Austria at the time, that in Berlin, the capital of Germany, in Berlin, the situation is serious, but not hopeless. Whereas in Vienna, the situation is hopeless, but not serious. It was a different attitude towards life. North Germans think that South Germans are very lazy and laid back. South Germans tend to think North Germans are money mad and then much too serious about life. Frederick William, Franz Joseph I, lived a life surrounded by tragedy. One catastrophe after another seemed to happen, as a matter of fact. In 1867, his brother Maximilian, who had become Emperor of Mexico, of all things. I haven't time to go into that. The French had foreclosed on the Mexican non-payment of debts and imposed rule. Napoleon III didn't think that appointing a Frenchman would be a good idea for international reasons, so he picked this Austrian Archduke. The Austrian Archduke Maximilian, a very nice man, Franz Josef's younger brother, and his new wife Carlotta went off to rule Mexico, but the Mexicans didn't like this very much. And when, after the end of the American Civil War, we decided to enforce the Monroe Doctrine and tell the French to take their army out of Mexico, and the French army was the only thing that was holding down the Mexicans, who were in the rebellion anyway. The French left. Maximilian refused to leave. He was shot by a Mexican firing squad. His wife, Carlotta, went mad for the rest of her life and had to be confined into her uncle's, her father's palace in Belgium. She lived into the 1920s. In 1889, Franz Josef's only son, Rudolf, who had apparently inherited some of the mental instability of the Habsburgs, which again is a separate topic, took his 17-year-old mistress up to their hunting lodge at Mayerling. He shot her and then he shot himself. That's why Franz Josef's successors had to be his nephews. He had no son after that. In 1898, Franz Josef's wife, the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, reputedly one of the most beautiful women in Europe, a woman who had had a reasonably satisfactory marriage, except that she loved to travel and not stay in Vienna, whereas this man got up at 4 o'clock every morning after sleeping on a cot and started his paperwork for the day. He was not a very adventuresome soul. He had a lot of work to do. His wife, Elizabeth, visiting Italy, was stabbed to death by an Italian anarchist who simply wanted to kill someone of royal blood. And then, of course, in 1914, on June 28th, the heir to the throne, the Emperor, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie Chotek, were shot dead in Sarajevo, the events that started the Civil War, the World War I. Franz Josef said, "Nothing is spared me in this world." It was hard to govern Austria. On one occasion, it is said that a man was recommended to the emperor for a government position with the words, "He is a real patriot." And the emperor looked a little sadly and said, "Yes, but is he a patriot for me?" Because in Austria, you could be a patriot for the Slovenes or the Slovaks or the Czechs or and not be a patriot for the central government. Franz Josef died in December of 1916, and it was merciful that he did. He didn't at least preside over the final dissolution. That was left to his nephew, Charles, who inherited the throne at the age of 30, married to a Belgian wife. He very much wanted to end World War I and get out of it. He could see that Austria was not going to survive World War I, even if they were on the winning side, which appeared a little unlikely by that time. But he could do nothing about that, and he simply presided over the complete collapse of Austria-Hungary, at which point he went into exile in Switzerland. What happened to Austria after that? Well, it broke up into pieces. This happened peacefully. These groups just seceded from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria became a small Germanic country, which is exactly what it still is. Hungary by the treaties ending World War I was limited mostly to areas that contained mostly Hungarians. The Magyars, who were very nationalistic, didn't like that. They resented the fact that they had lost a lot of their official territory, but that's what they got. Czechoslovakia was created because the Czechs and the Slovaks decided they could work together. If you've looked at the map recently, you know that didn't last. The Czechs and the Slovaks, in fact, were separate peoples, and first, Slovaks were given their independence in 1939 by Adolf Hitler, and then subsequently the country broke up again. The Serb, Croat, Slovene country, which at this time they didn't even have a name for when this map was made, was Yugoslavia. And you know what happened in Yugoslavia? Although Marshal Tito managed somehow to hold the place together while he was around, afterwards it broke up into some of the most horrible ethnic conflicts we've had in the 1990s. You're all old enough to remember that horror, and now has broken up into a whole bunch of little countries which are still not very friendly. Again, one must be amazed at the miracle that Austria-Hungary was able to maintain peace and order in this area for so very long. And I suppose the Habsburg family needs a certain amount of, merits a certain amount of congratulations for that. So, what can we say in conclusion? It's very difficult to make democracies work. If a country doesn't have a democratic tradition and a tradition of compromise, it's very hard to make democracies work. In countries that have had monarchies for a long time, the transition, if there should be one, should be gentle. Or maybe it shouldn't happen at all. All of us, of course, are aware of a situation vaguely similar. Elizabeth II passed away. She's been Queen of England for all our lives. You can't remember England without Elizabeth II. She was the perfect constitutional monarch, and her passing was correctly mourned by the whole world. Maybe a system like that can be useful. It is a fact. Well, I shouldn't say a fact. I think I believe it to be true that democracy, which we all support, is a wonderful thing when it works properly. But as Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. Well, I think there's some truth in that. It is certainly true that if there had been an emperor in Germany, if the Hohenzollern system had continued, Adolf Hitler could never have become Chancellor of the Reich. In fact, Adolf Hitler would have been lucky to have been hired to empty the wastebaskets in the Reich Chancellery, not sit in the chair. There's not the faintest possibility that Lenin or Stalin could have come to power in Russia if Russia had remained under the Romanovs. Not that they came to power democratically, but that the way things developed enabled them to come to power. So there was a price to pay for these attempts at democracy. And we must be always careful to remember that democracy is a precious thing that is not always easy to keep and to maintain and should not be taken for granted. Thank you very much. And now, if you have any questions. Now, certainly, if you have any questions or comments, I welcome them.
How far did the Turks ever get into Serbia, Croatia, and Romania?
Well, that depends on what part of history you're looking at. In the 17th century, they had most of it. The history of the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, is one of gradual dissolution and decay. And it finally faded away in the Balkan Wars, the First and Second Balkan Wars in 1911 and 1913. They lost all the territory in Europe except for that part around Constantinople or Istanbul that they still have. Yes.
How did England avoid being caught up in this? How did they manage to keep their king?
Okay, well, for a while, of course, they didn't keep their king. In 1649, they cut off his head. England went through its difficulties earlier. That was decided in the 17th century in the English Civil Wars, both of them, when Charles I, having lost the war and lost his head, they instead wound up with Oliver Cromwell, who felt himself forced to set up a kind of military dictatorship with Puritan rule. That wasn't too popular. And after Oliver Cromwell finally did something that was very popular, namely he died in 1658, they decided to restore the king. But the new king, Charles II, was well aware that his power came from Parliament. They had invited him in exile back. And after that, the king's power was almost voluntarily limited. It was still there. The king still appointed the prime minister for a long time. The king still had power, but he shared it with Parliament. Then after the extinction of the Stuart family, after the death of Queen Anne in 1714, I think, the crown was passed to Germans in order to avoid giving it to the Catholic descendants of James II. They didn't want Catholics ruling in England. They said that didn't work out well. So although a third of England's population was still Catholic, there were no Catholics at the top. They appointed George of England, George of Hanover, became King George I. George I couldn't speak English. Of course, in those days, most educated people spoke French, but nonetheless, he came over from Hanover well aware that he was there because Parliament had picked him. And so he didn't rock the boat very much, and things developed peacefully since then. But the British had some excitement. It was just earlier than this. Anything else?
Russians had slaves, they were serfs.
They were called serfs, yes.
In the United States. And what was the other country?
Brazil.
Brazil, okay. And that was worldwide. I mean, otherwise all the other countries have eliminated.
I said all the civilized countries. I don't want to be too invidious here, but I was implying that the countries of Europe and North America had done so. There were places in the world where there was still slavery. I believe there still are, for that matter, but that's separate. But of developed countries, I guess that's the word I should use. Developed countries. Yes.
Churches a role in all of this stuff. Lots of religions there, and were they?
Yes, certainly. This was a period of. Do you mean in Austria-Hungary or the whole business? Freedom of religion was recognized by the 20th century, the early 20th century, in all of these countries, even in Russia. For example, the foreign minister, Nikolai Karlovich Gears, the foreign minister of Russia under Alexander III, who was certainly a Russian, if there ever was one, was in fact a Protestant. That didn't prevent him from rising to this high position. So religion did not play a major role in any of this. I mean, as far as religious conflict went, and even in Austria-Hungary, there seemed to have been on the whole religious tolerance. In Austria-Hungary, unlike other European countries, had a substantial Muslim minority down here, but this didn't affect things. The Muslims tended to like the central government of Francis Joseph, partly because their immediate neighbors were not so friendly to them, and the government tended to protect them to some degrees. There were Muslim military units, a few of them, in the Austro-Hungarian army. Well, I don't want to feel as if I'm dismissing a class here. You folks invited me, and now, now I'm done. So it's up to you, I think, to decide what to do. But I do thank you very much for coming today. If I seemed a little rusty, it's been 6.5 years since I gave a public presentation. But I do like this material, which I taught for so many years at Shattuck St. Mary's. And I thank you for sparing the time to come and listen. Yes, sir.
Would you be interested in coming back on different topics of?
That's a possibility. I have to discuss it with the, yes, I say Bob can't be here today because but we will see. And if the group, whatever the group is, should invite me, that's certainly a possibility. I think today I bit off almost more than I could chew in that covering these huge topics. I mean, I felt a little guilty sometimes. Maybe I should have just taken Russia today, but at any rate, it was something. It certainly is. It's very big, yes. Yes, you notice I didn't mention Rasputin. And that was quite deliberate because contrary to what many people think, Rasputin, although a fascinating figure, an intriguing figure, did not, in fact, have much influence on the Russian government until after the start of World War I, starting around 1915, when it was a little too late. And of course, he was done away with, we think, in December of 1916 by Prince Yusupov and his friends. Rasputin had great influence over the Empress, and Rasputin, and this is another reason I didn't mention him, he's one of those historical figures that historians don't like to deal with. Rather like Joan of Arc on another happier plane. You don't want to introduce miracles into a history lecture. I mean, we can't footnote them, you know, and yet some of what Rasputin did is almost inexplicable. But really, he was not the ruler of Russia in any sense. And he was not Alexandra, the Empress's lover at all. He had many lady friends, but she wasn't one of them. And so his influence tends to be exaggerated in the popular press, although he is a fascinating, literally, figure.
I was the only person I ever knew who was shot, poisoned, and stabbed to death. All about the same time.
They had some trouble doing him in. That's true. Yes, that is correct. And the autopsy said that the cause of death was drowning, water in the lungs. I used to go through that with my students, and then after I reached the point where they had loaded him down with chains and stuffed him through the ice and went back to the palace, I would say, and a few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. But that was, could I have some more cake? But that was just a joke. When you're teaching 10th graders, you have to do things like that. That's I try not to confuse the teaching of history with stand-up comedy. Sometimes, however, it must be admitted there are similarities. Anything else? Okay, well, again, thank you for coming. And,
Thank you for coming. My name is Mona Kaiser. I actually am the director here. Got called away to take a kid to the emergency room. Even adult children have needs, right? So anyway, other people filled in. Dr. Libby has graciously agreed to do this for us. And I see these wonderful new faces. So this is where the cool kids hang out, Buckham West. So just so you know, you can always come back. We got other great things going on. So yeah, Bill.
Do I understand we're off now with Irby's for 3 weeks? And this is going to be back on again?
Okay, yes, Bob, Bob's class is planning, Bob is planning to do another 6-week series. I think we're gonna do one in December because so many things happening. Bob and I talked about maybe doing something we're gonna call a bridge. And maybe we'll talk about Dr. Irby's, whoever.
the students used to do that too. They got the two of us confused. We don't look much alike, but the names have some similarity, yes.
So sorry. We'll do something one time in December and then we'll start 6 weeks. So if you like him, you want Dr. Irby back. I think Bob is watching on, I don't know if he's watching or not, but he was going to try to watch us. We hope. Yeah, we recorded it. Okay, come on. Very good. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
I have one more question for you, sir, then I'll leave you alone. On the way, there were very, I read a little very recent. Even in the church, about and confess who else. What else is there?
And he,
every old, the whole film. See the priests with their finest garbs and their heads wrapped with oh, they're unbelievable. And the women who were in charge of cemetery. The hand behind the pump. Vast majority. Blessing and tones during the war. The French army was too busy executing their own. Thank you very much. My daughter.
Not till 11. See you later.
She has 22 grandchildren. Oh, yeah. And then all the great, great. I mean, great, great. A lot. I don't want to get too